It's really nice to be here in this wonderful surroundings and to be in Rhode Island, which I think arguably deserves the title as the birthplace of religious liberty in America. If I could just do a personal anecdote about that, many years ago, 20 years ago, whatever, when I was teaching in Vermont, my wife and I took an extended weekend and came down. I think it was Sturbridge Village, my wife wanted to see that, and I later forced her to come to Providence. I've been in Providence before, where I'd been accepted to go to graduate school, but had not decided not to go to Brown. But anyway, I wanted to see campus, and then of course, what I really wanted to see was First Baptist Church. I have very deep Baptist roots going back many generations. And so, of course, First Baptist Church in Providence, which is a beautiful building, I guess built around the latter part of the 18th century, is arguably the birthplace for Baptists in America. And certainly with the involvement of Roger Williams in the creation of the congregation, however fleeting that involvement was, still, it has this high significance for church state junkies like myself. And so I actually saw this building. So just so happened it was on a Sunday morning, and church was just about getting out. So we just waited until church was out. And after people basically had filed out, my wife and I started walking up toward the church. And right when we got the steps, all of a sudden, kind of like out of the darkness, I had no idea where they came from, came two Providence police officers. And they came up to me as I was going up the steps and said, "I'm sorry, you can't go in that church." And I said, I'm out of town, I just want to say, "No," I'm kind of testy. "No, I'm sorry, you can't go in the church. The church is closed." And I just kind of stepped back for a minute. You can see my wife was starting to get really concerned at this point. And I said, "Let me make sure I got this straight. You are two city police officers, and you're telling me I cannot go into a church? And not just any church, this church?" And there's some kind of, I think the mayor was going to be there that afternoon. They had some kind of event. They were just trying to spirit, it wasn't anything anti-religious or whatever. And so I started kind of lecturing them about the separation of church and state. At the same time, my wife was kicking me in the shins. Like, just leave it alone, okay? I don't want to end up in jail. But it does show sometimes an argument can prevail because they just basically had enough, okay? Just go in the friggin' church, Just leave us alone. And it's a beautiful church. I'm so glad we did. But anyway, so that's one of my anecdotes about religious liberty in America, particularly with Rhode Island, the history of separation of churches. Well, the question that this presentation seeks to address is whether a vulnerable constitutional and political principle can arise out of an allegedly corrupt history. I mean, one possible example would be the concept of popular democracy, of course. Did the excesses of the French Revolution invalidate the American ideals of popular democracy that had just come into being several years earlier? Now, of course, we say no. I mean, that happened in a different country at a different, not necessarily a different time, but under entirely different circumstances. So there's no guilt by association of those types of excesses with the concept of popular government. Another example, which would probably most likely come to your mind, would of course be the argument about that surrounded the principle of equality in the Declaration of Independence for at least 200 years. It's been highly contested, the extent to which that equality that was announced in such wonderful language really had such a limited concept among many of the founders, at least the argument has been. And so consequently you had people like Frederick Douglass who basically disdained the Declaration of Independence and criticized the concept of equality. And you contrast that 100 years later with Martin Luther King, of course, embracing that concept of equality. So sometimes we understand that principles can evolve. Probably the most difficult example would be one that I often propose in my constitutional law classes on equal protection, would be the issue about racial segregation in the schools. Does our sordid history of racial discrimination and subordination associated with segregation mean that a proposal for an all-black school in an inner city to teach self-esteem to African American youth would be suspect by virtue of that past history of segregation? Well, these can be difficult questions, and so that's why I thought it was an interesting way of approaching this. Of course, the topic of our conference today is religious tolerance and intolerance, and so the question I wish to address is that of separation of church and state, as articulated by the modern Supreme Court. does the past history of this doctrine that was allegedly used to promote religious intolerance during the 19th century delegitimize that principle? Well, no organizing theory has had greater impact on the way we conceptualize that intersection between religion, culture, and politics than that principle of separation of church and state. Since the early 19th century, judges, politicians, and educators, and even religious leaders have embraced church-state separation as not only central to church-state relations, but as a cornerstone of American democracy. The Supreme Court first employed the term separation of church and state in 1878 as a shorthand meaning for the First Amendment's religion clauses, stating that, quote, it may be accepted almost as an authoritative declaration of the scope and effect of that amendment. However, it was not until the mid-20th century that incorporation of the Bill of Rights to the states that separation of church and state became constitutional canon. In the modern court's first establishment clause holding, Everson versus Board of Education in 1947, Justice Hugo Black wrote that the establishment of religion in the First Amendment means at least this, that neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church, neither can pass laws to aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one over another. No tax in any amount, large or small, can be levied to support any religious activities or institutions, whatever they may be called. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect, quote, a wall of separation between church and state. Okay. Well, for approximately 50 years, separation of church and state was the touchstone for church-state jurisprudence, endorsed by liberal and conservative justices alike. Particularly in the earlier years, justices opined that separation must be, quote, absolute, uncompromising, high and impenetrable, complete and permanent, although the rhetoric was usually so much more absolute than the ultimate decisions. So in essence, while many people may have disagreed with that type of rhetoric, few, if any, contested the bona fides underlying the principle. All of the separationist or strict separationist perspective, if you want to call it that, has been used to invalidate a host of activities concerning the government's use of religion, such as the display of Ten Commandments monuments. The original and most frequent application of the principle was in two areas: to limit the government's ability to fund religious institutions, chiefly parochial schools, and then to restrict religious exercises in the public schools. In fact, we are marking the 50th anniversary of those seminal U.S. Supreme Court decisions about prayer and Bible reading in the schools. Approximately two-thirds of the court's separationist holdings between 1947 and 1993, and that's just my date I pull out before the conservative majority came into dominance, involved controversies over school prayer and public funding of religion. And of those two areas, the no-funding principle, as it was known, had a constitutional pedigree reaching back into the mid-19th century. Few people, aside from Catholic school officials, questioned the legitimacy of the no-funding principle, with most disagreement occurring over how that principle should be applied. So in essence, were auxiliary services such as nurses, speech pathologists, bus transportation, were those permissible under the no-funding principle? Few people, though, disputed the core principle. In the Everson case, in fact, the brief on behalf of the Catholic bishops actually expressed no disagreement with the concept of separation of church and state or the no-funding principle in principle. But beginning in the 1980s, consensus surrounding separation of church and state began to unravel. First, scholars began to challenge the accuracy of the Jeffersonian model of church-state separation, arguing that it was unrepresentative of attitudes during the founding period. In addition, religious conservatives, led by the emergent religious right, raised arguments that separation of church and state was hostile to religion and to people of faith and inconsistent with constitutional values. This view popularized in books such as Stephen Carter's The Culture of Disbelief, John Newhouse's The Naked Public Square. Others have charged that separationism is the wrong paradigm, that an opposite model of accommodation or church-state engagement was and is still more accurate. Now, this critique reinforces a larger movement within academia that challenges the secularization thesis that dominated most of the 20th century. This post-secularization critique, represented by the works of James Davidson Hunter, among others, maintains that culture has never been secularized, such that the nation is not represented by the image portrayed in the holdings of the modern Supreme Court. Writing from a different perspective, David Shahat argues that separation of church and state was always a myth, and the rhetoric masked, in fact, a repressive alliance between government and religious forces that inhibited religious quality. So under either telling, separation of church and state is ahistorical. This has led conservative justices, starting with Justice William Rehnquist before he was Chief Justice, to add their voices of criticism, leading them to basically, on the court's conservative majority, start cutting back on separationist holdings. Before long, the cornerstone of church-state separation, the no-funding principle, came under attack, with conservative majority opening the door to indirect funding of religious schools through mechanisms such as vouchers and tax credits. Notwithstanding that level of criticism, critics of church-state separation were not content with simply redefining the scope of the no-funding principle or even cutting back on its application. They began to attack the legitimacy of the principle itself at its most core level. Led by Philip Hamburger in his influential 2002 book, Separation of Church and State, conservative scholars have challenged the historical bona fides of separationism, arguing the concept was not only alien in the founding generation, but that it emerged as a legal doctrine in the 19th century as a way to maintain Protestant dominance of the culture at the expense of Catholics and other religious minorities. That dominance was, of course, manifested chiefly through the Protestant control of the public schools and the refusal to fund Catholic schooling based on its sectarian content. Under this accounting, therefore, church-state separation is not simply ahistorical, but it is also a profane, illiberal, and corrupt concept. Court conservatives have picked up on this theme, with Justice Clarence Thomas charging in 2002 that, quote, hostility to providing aid to pervasively sectarian schools has a shameful pedigree, that opposition to the aid of sectarian schools acquired prominence in the 1870s, this is Justice Thomas continuing, with Congress's consideration and near passage of the Blaine Amendment, which would have amended the Constitution to bar any any aid to sectarian institutions. Consideration of that amendment arose at a time of pervasive hostility to the Catholic Church and to Catholics in general, and it was an open secret that sectarian was a code for Catholic, end quote. So in short, Justice Thomas has concluded that there's nothing in the Establishment Clause requires the government to exclude religious schools from receiving public funds. He said that the no-funding principle and the pervasively sectarian doctrine were born of bigotry and should be buried now. Well, it's pretty remarkable when the Supreme Court actually comes out and outwardly criticizes a principle that itself has been very responsible for creating. This revisionist account of church-state separation and the no-funding rule, one that considers both concepts as corrupt due to their purported historical legacy, has attracted a large following among conservative legal and religious scholars and many Republican politicians. As in the past, at least in the 1980s, politicians of both parties actually expressed fealty to separation of church and state. Richard Nixon, for one, openly endorsed the concept. But now most Republicans condemn separationism, while Democrats commonly try to avoid discussing it as much as possible. In fact, just last week, I filed an amicus brief at the United States Supreme Court on the current church-state case dealing with prayer and city council meetings conducted almost entirely by evangelical Protestants. And I was somewhat disappointed to see the Obama administration filing an amicus brief on the other side, basically saying that this practice was not unconstitutional. And from what I remember reviewing the brief, they made no comment at all about separation of church and state. It's now become just this third rail phrase you don't embrace. So as a result, we must consider the allegations about history of separation of church and state. Professor Hamburger is too good of a historian for his account to be completely wrong. Well, we know that early common schools promoted a generic Protestant curriculum termed non-sectarianism. Protestant prayer and Bible reading were common practices in many schools throughout the century, and although most studies have failed to document how those practices really evolved over time, becoming increasingly more secular and pro forma. But proponents of public education employed the concept of church-state separation to restrict public funding to the emergent common schools. Separation of church and state became a handy retort for turning aside Catholic requests for a proportional share of the state school funds for the parochial schools. And then at the same time, most educators, Protestant educators, saw no conflict between separation of church and state and Protestant-oriented instruction in the public schools. So in essence, separation of church and state prevented the funding or teaching of sectarian instruction in schools, which was usually equated with Catholic education, but permitted the generic non-sectarian instruction in public schools. And then, because the Protestant exercises were considered to be non-sectarian, they were not offensive, they were universal, and therefore they could not be seen as offending Catholic religious sensibilities. Aside from those specific applications, though, the allegation is the separation of church and state became a tool to delegitimize Catholic schools themselves, as well as the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church with its long-standing association with European religious establishments. Separation of church and state was identified with liberal Republican values and rights of religious conscience, while the Catholic Church was depicted as supporting the opposite. Protestant nativists quickly embraced the concept of church-state separation, becoming some of the strongest proponents, using it to legitimize their campaign of religious and ethnic bigotry. Thus, the argument goes, separation of church and state fueled a pervasive anti-Catholicism in America for over 100 years, reinforcing and perpetuating a suspicion, if not outright hostility and intolerance toward Catholics in the Catholic Church. At the same time, it perpetuated a form of Protestant hegemony over the culture, ensuring that Catholics existed in a second-class status. So back to my initial question. Does a principle's association with intolerance forever invalidate it, or can it be rehabilitated? Well, in order to address this question, we need to unpack some of Professor Hamburger's claims about the evolution and the use of separation of church and state in the 19th century. First, once again, Hamburger claims the separation of church and state arose as a popular concept in the middle of the 19th century, chiefly in reaction to the massive influx of Catholic immigrants brought on by the Irish potato famine and other economic crises in Europe. People embraced the concept not because it was a noble principle, but chiefly to legitimize a pervasive anti-Catholicism. Well, again, no one disputes the American legacy of anti-Catholicism, an impulse that actually reaches back to the earliest days of colonial America. The Protestant settlers of British colonial America just defined themselves in large respect by the degree to which they rejected Catholic doctrines. And Protestants universally condemned the corruptions of the Catholic Church. The anti-Catholic sentiments expressed in the letters of many of the founding fathers are actually quite shocking and unsettling to modern ears. I invite any of you to read John Adams' letters. You'll be amazed. Though Chris Benecke has demonstrated that toleration of Catholics did increase significantly during the founding period, so it was not just a static concept. While anti-Catholicism lay somewhat dormant until it experienced a resurgence in the late 1830s with the first true wave of Catholic immigration. Now, Protestant Americans grew alarmed at the growing number of Catholic immigrants, Irish initially and then Germans and Italians, who are often seen as clannish, living in isolated communities, and refusing to assimilate into the larger culture. At the time, the national identity was still being formed. And then people viewed immigrants who refused to assimilate with dramatic suspicion. Protestant Americans also feared the growing influence of the Catholic Church. Protestants, as I said earlier, Protestant leaders argued the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church was inconsistent with democratic values. Authoritarian and autocratic, the Catholic Church looked dangerously un-American, partly because it didn't harmonize easily with the concept of individual freedom embedded in the national culture, according to one newspaper. In contrast to the Catholic Church's top-down interpretation of doctrine, Protestantism relied on a system of unmediated interpretation of Scripture, which the Protestants asserted was more consistent with freedom of conscience. Now, the Catholic hierarchy only fueled such suspicions by issuing letters and edicts that condemned democratic movements and religious toleration, as well as the principle of separation of church and state, which, of course, Protestants always picked up and publicized as quickly as they could. Protestant Americans also believed Catholic clergy, with their absolute authority over matters of Catholic doctrine, interfered with the ability of rank-and-file Catholics to develop that independence of thought necessary to participate in Republican governance. In contrast, again, Protestantism, with its emphasis on congregational polity in many instances, always with greater involvement of lay control, was seen as being consistent with principles of democratic self-governance. Thus, for many 19th century Americans, Protestant Americans, Catholicism
represented a similar threat to the nation, to core Republican values, as did communism a century later. As a result, as we all know, America experienced an upsurge in anti-Catholicism in the 1840s, 1850s, with outbreaks of violence in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, among other cities. This initial phase of nativism peaked in the 1850s with the rise, of course, of the Know Nothing Party, which proposed disbanding convents and imposing 25-year residency requirements for citizenship and voting, among many other things. Now, of course, the popular appeal of nativism is a complicated matter beyond the scope of this presentation. Many scholars now contend that nativism had more to do with issues of ethnicity and economic dislocation than with religious animus. In essence, anti-Catholicism was chiefly a proxy for other issues. But still, anti-Catholicism was a central theme of the nativist movement and cannot be ignored. And as it happened, Catholic immigration, the upsurge of nativism, coincided with the rise of American public schooling. Now, public school advocates perceived several specific threats from Catholic immigration. Catholics would resist assimilating their children into the Protestant common schools and thus committing themselves to the American project. That a competing system of Catholic schools would undermine their ideal of universal public education. And then, of course, that a competing system of Catholic schools would threaten their financial monopoly over the state school funds and further undermine the development of public education. So in early contest over the last issue, public school educators argued that the funding of Catholic sectarian education was inconsistent with the constitutional principle of separation of church and state. And once again, almost in the same breath, these same public school educators defended Protestant instruction in their schools as being consistent with Republican values. Again, unmediated Bible reading reinforced freedom of conscience. Non-sectarian public education and the funding of Catholic schools just became a focal point in the growing conflict between immigrant Catholics and the native Protestant majority. In 1844 Philadelphia, it escalated into 2 days of bloody riots over the issue of whether you could allow schools in Catholic wards to read Catholic Bible. And nativists, of course, used the issues of Bible reading and parochial school funding to inflame their supporters while announcing their undying allegiance to the principle of separation of church and state. Well, considering this history, and I think all that history is completely accurate, one may question the legitimacy of separation of church and state as a constitutional principle. In essence, rather than promoting religious liberty, as we've been told, church-state separation may have been used to perpetuate religious intolerance. Again, this accounting is accurate in many respects, but it's also somewhat incomplete. First, my research into 19th century legal cases has demonstrated that the legal doctrine of church-state separation actually arose prior to the significant influx of Catholic immigrants in mid-century, and was applied in a host of cases that had nothing to do with religious exercises, parochial school funding, or the Protestant-Catholic conflict. Beginning in the early part of the century and continuing throughout, judges and lawyers raised principles of separationism in manners ranging from church property disputes and estate challenges to cases concerning the enforcement of Sabbath laws and religious oath requirements. For example, in striking down a Sunday law in the 1850s, the California Supreme Court declared that the state constitution guaranteed, quote, not only complete toleration, but religious liberty in its largest sense, a complete separation of church and state. When conflicts arose over non-sectarian education and the funding of Catholic schools, educators and judges simply applied an existing legal principle to their situation. Thus, while separation of church and state was most frequently applied in the education context, its origins were actually much earlier and its scope much broader than merely the school cases. Even if one focuses solely on church-state separation in the educational context, however, it is important to note that several early controversies over religious school funding did not involve Catholic schools. In two early controversies arising in New York in the 1820s, people raised arguments about church-state separation as a way to turn back funding applications from Baptist and Methodist schools. Now, to be sure, by mid-century, most Protestant schools had either closed or been integrated into the common schools, absent Lutheran schools that continued for not only religious but ethnic and language reasons. As a result, the no funding rule was applied chiefly with respect to Catholic schools. And following the Civil War, Protestant-Catholic tensions reignited over the issue of parochial school funding and the funding of religious charities, as well as the issue of Bible reading. Educators and Protestant clergy circled their wagons around public schools, while Republican politicians seized upon the school question for crass political gain. In 1875, Republicans proposed a constitutional amendment expressly to prohibit religious school funding, commonly called the Blaine Amendment. Separation of church and state again became that rallying cry for a new round of anti-Catholicism. Yet while some people used the concept to appeal to baser motives and instincts, others viewed it as an important principle that ensured the integrity and independence of both religious and governmental institutions, and as a way to finally settle the ongoing Protestant-Catholic conflict. By this point in time, there was an emergent new free thought movement in America, as well as split within evangelicalism between the more moderates and the conservatives, with many of those other people, non-conservatives, embracing separation of church and state and also questioning some of its prior justifications. So while the Blaine Amendment has been tarred as an episode in religious bigotry, the event was actually more complicated and nuanced than a simple binary analysis would suggest. The related claim is that church-state separation was always used for the benefit of Protestants, to the detriment of Catholics. This also deserves a closer look. Hamburger and others argue that Protestants applied the principle of separation of church and state selectively and hypocritically, that church-state separation condemned the sectarianism of the Catholic Church but did not apply to the non-sectarian religious activities in the common school. In essence, separationism promoted a form of Protestant hegemony in the culture. Well, religious historians such as Robert Handy have long written about the prominent Protestant dominance of 19th century American culture. Spurred by a series of revivals and camp meetings in the early century, evangelical Protestantism grew exponentially, and Protestant attitudes and values permeated not only the public education, but many American institutions by the 1830s. In fact, Handy once observed that, quote, in many ways, the middle third of the 19th century was more of a Protestant age than was the colonial period with established churches. Well, considering the historical and democratic advantages that Protestants possessed, 200 years of cultural dominance before the rise of Catholic immigration, it's difficult to see how much church-state separation contributed to their hegemonic hold on 19th century culture. Protestant suspicions of Catholicism and nativist intolerance of Catholics all would have occurred in the absence of any constitutional doctrine. And even if separation of church and state was a leading factor in influencing public attitudes, it was not always supportive of Protestant hegemony, particularly after the Civil War. As I've demonstrated in an earlier book, church-state separation was actually an evolving concept throughout the 19th century. Initially, few people conceived of separation as representing more than that formal uncoupling of political and religious institutions and functions. As a result, initially, it did not challenge the legal and cultural preferences of Protestants. So early on, courts reaffirmed that favored status by upholding Sabbath and blasphemy laws, many times on a religious basis. But over time, however, judges came to uncouple the law's normative basis from religion in the 19th century. Leading the way was a secularizing impulse in the law itself, one facilitated by a desire to see the law respond to a changing commercial and demographic forces. In a drive to make the law more professional and responsive to a developing economy, lawyers and judges began to divorce the law from its moral and religious trappings. Contract law stopped caring about whether a party was at fault in a breach, now focusing on what was an agreed upon price for the default contained in the contract. To not fulfill a contract or some other financial obligation stopped being seen as a moral failing and simply became a business matter. Probate law also abandoned its prohibition against honoring irreligious bequests deemed inconsistent with Christian principles. It was actually very common in the early part of the 19th century that if you wanted to give a bequest to an irreligious institution, like a temple of free thought, courts would regularly reject that, saying that this was inconsistent with Christian principles. That was rejected. Blasphemy prosecutions, common once again during the first third of the century, died off due to a growing discomfort over the law punishing expressions of religious dissent. No longer would the law protect the dominant religious sensibilities in the absence of true public disturbance. In essence, it changed into disorderly conduct, which was now measured objectively not by the claim of the religious institution. And then over time, prosecutions for profaning the Sabbath, they decreased, and religious justifications for Sunday laws shifted to health safety rationales instead of making people moral. This overall impulse in the law helped secularize not just the substance and institutions of the law, but then also change the way in which people envisioned the role of the law in reinforcing religious norms. So whereas at the beginning of the 19th century, judges commonly referred to, quote, Christianity as being part of the common law, by centuries end, that phrase and concept had fallen into great disfavor. Now, while some remnants of morality remained in a handful of legal fields, such as criminal and domestic law, overall, the law became unconcerned with moral questions. The law as an institution became amoral. So as a result of this transformation, that was probably more legal history than this crowd wanted to hear. As a result of this transformation, jurists, intellectuals, and religious leaders increasingly came to view separation of church and state as an expansive concept, one that mandated greater religious toleration. In several cases involving Sunday laws and oath-takings, courts expressly employed separation of church and state to undermine the dominant Protestant practices and assumptions in the laws. Now again, the most significant instance, back to our question about the school question, the most significant instance where separation of church and state was used to challenge Protestant hegemony was in the infamous Cincinnati Bible case of 1869. In that year, the Cincinnati School Board voted to rescind its practice of daily prayer and Bible reading in hope of attracting more Catholic students back into the public schools. Conservative Protestants objected, and they succeeded in getting an injunction to reinstate the practice. Let me find how much time I have. Okay. One judge in that panel, though, objected to the reinstatement, agreeing with the court's removal of the Bible and prayer in the schools. Judge Alphonso Taft, name must sound kind of familiar, the father of a future president and chief justice. He argued that the Constitution required, quote, absolute equality before the law of all religious opinions and sects. To hold that Protestants were entitled to have their mode of worship and their Bible used in the school, Taft continued, is to hold to a union of church and state. On appeal, a unanimous Ohio Supreme Court agreed with Taft, ruling that prayer and Bible reading were inconsistent with separation of church and state, much to the dismay of evangelical Protestants. Well, the number of cases striking down Bible reading in the 19th century are quite small. In fact, only one other significant case exists. But the decisions indicated an evolution in public attitudes that was underway. A large number of urban school districts decided simply to abandon their religious exercises to accommodate Catholic complaints, while a growing number of educators and liberal ministers started calling for abolishing the practices completely. Prominent minister Henry Ward Beecher wrote that it was, quote, too late to adopt the church-state doctrine. Schools, he wrote, have no business to teach religion or to show partiality to one or another sect. Quite clearly, he was talking about Protestantism. Again, the number of late 19th century and early 20th century cases outlawing religious exercises in public schools was never large, but they, in conjunction with the actions by these urban school boards de-emphasizing or eliminating religious exercises, created a perception in the late 19th century that schools were becoming secularized. A national survey conducted by the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1887 confirmed that perception, with it noting that the Bible was not being read in schools in 175 counties out of 254 that reported. That's a significant number. Where religious exercises persisted, wrote the WCTU report, Bible reading frequently was, quote, not so generally read as just pro forma. In a series of late century reports by the U.S. Commission on Education, also documented this phenomenon, noting that not only was religious instruction in decline, but so too was the Bible's use as even a textbook to teach morals and literature. Even the amount of time devoted to character and moral instruction was under decline. In his 1895 report, Commissioner W.T. Harris concluded that, quote, outside of New England, there is no considerable area where the Bible's use can be said to be uniform. This condition has come about as much by indifference as by opposition. there's been a change in public sentiment gradually toward the complete secularization of government and its institutions. Secularization of the schools is accepted or urged by many devout people who deem it safer than to trust others with the interpretation of laws of conscience. And summarizing this trend in the next century of the previous century, in 1912, Columbia Teachers College study stated that, quote, over a century there's been the gradual but widespread elimination of religious and church influences in public education. In every state, the study continued, religious instruction was either entirely eliminated or at least reduced to the barest and most formal elements. The study attributed this transformation to two factors. One was the conviction that the Republic can securely rest only on an educated citizenship. The second was a sacred regard by the state for religious opinion of the individual citizen and freedom of conscience. So by the last quarter of the 19th century, separation of church and state was increasingly seen as promoting a form of secularism in the culture, again to the dismay of most conservative Protestants. Even though Catholic officials also skewed the growing secularism at the time, they were now the beneficiaries of church-state separation, at least with respect to the issue of religious exercises in the public schools. Now, to be sure, church-state separation and its corollary, the no funding principle, also continued to limit the funding of religious schools. Catholics continued to argue the no funding rule promoted discrimination against Catholic schools, but then Catholics were not the only groups affected by the rule, as there were some decisions later on that also applied to Episcopal and Lutheran schools as well. One could thus argue that separation has provided affirmative benefits to American society. While initially conceived and applied in limited ways, it was a principle that couldn't be cabined. It was a spacious conception, to use a phrase of Justice Felix Frankfurter. Separation is in transition from providing, I think, mere toleration to ensuring greater religious equality, particularly for religious minorities. I can remember many years ago when I was working in Washington, D.C. on these issues, coming before the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. They were doing, this was when they were, majority of them were appointed by, I guess, by Reagan and Bush 1, as long ago as this was, I guess. Anyway, they were going to just want to have some hearings about whether, again, separation of church and state is anti-religious. And I remember I was sitting next to, I think that president at the time of the Anti-Defamation League. And one thing he said, which I thought was very moving, he basically said, there are two clauses in the Constitution, well, three, but there are two clauses in the First Amendment that deal with religious liberty, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. He says, not to minimize the importance of the Free Exercise Clause, but he said for religious minorities, the Establishment Clause is actually our Free Exercise Clause. Well, Hamburger's narrative has illuminated our understanding of the past. It demonstrates that history is never simple and clearly is never sanitized. Intolerance of strange and foreign religious and ethnic groups has been a part of our history since day one, as we've struggled as a society to struggle on what it means to be an American. As David Byron Davis once reminded us, Americans have long feared that new groups and ideas would subvert that fragile American values and institutions rather than enriching them. So the road from mere tolerance to equality has never been straight or without obstacles, nor has it been progressively linear. Many political values we now hold dear, racial and gender equality, sexual orientation, have all taken a very long time to evolve. But in the same way that we should not condemn equality as proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence because of imperfect earlier applications, we should also not condemn separation of church and state. As Justice O'Connor wrote poignantly in her final church-state opinion, those who would renegotiate the boundaries between church and state must thus answer a difficult question. Why would we trade a system that has served us so well for one that has served others so poorly? Thank you. Do we do questions, or does everybody want to go outside where it's cool? In the back.
Thank you. I have a study saying that public schools are really secularizing. And my little bits of research would go along with that. I was doing some research in Newport here, and I was looking at the school records, and one of the board members was a Catholic priest for the public schools. And he was sitting on the board with the Episcopal minister down the street. And I told the archivist for the diocese here, I said, this is wild, there was a Catholic priest sitting on the public school board in the 19 teens. And he said, oh no, there was in every city in Rhode Island. There were Catholic priests on the public school board, Providence, Bristol, all the
Sure.
And then he said, New York State Public, the State Board of Ed, there's a priest on the board. So my sense would be that early 20th century, it's actually Catholics and Protestants working together in public schools. After the Blaine Amendment, I think that's the high point of anti-Catholicism. But I think there's much more of a joint concern about secularism.
Yeah.
And then there's one other little anecdote. I just was reviewing a book about the New Mexico school system.
Oh,
a case called the Zeller case.
Yeah.
And there were 200 nuns teaching in the public schools from 1910 to 1948. They were superintendent of school boards, public school, because I kept reading about public school board. Priests were running school board. And then the woman writing the book said 21 different states had nuns and priests as principals of public schools in the Midwest and Nebraska and North Dakota. And they're wearing their habits. And so I just thought, wow, this is a very different vision of what I thought public schools were in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So I don't know how that fits into your narrative.
Yeah. That last book is a really nice little book. It's called Religious Lessons.
Yeah, that's it.
And it's about what some people call captive schools, which was hybrid schools in many places that were run by religious orders. In fact, there's a town right near where I live in Oregon that has a Catholic seminary, and the town was basically formed by German Catholics. And the public elementary school is across the street from the big Catholic church there, and it's called St. Mary's Public School. And it's just a little too close for me, I think. So yeah, you do have those histories that go back. Time limitations, and without going into a lot of the stuff that my books have gone over, you're completely correct with everything you said. It was less in reality than was the perception. And that I think that there was a perception, and it was promoted by many people. William Torrey Harris, who was the Commissioner of Education, he was initially the Superintendent of Public Schools in St. Louis in the 1860s and 1870s. He was a very interesting person, very much supported separation of church and state. And when he became Commissioner of Education, he really tried to promote the idea of secular education. I'm not saying his statistics were skewed, but he kind of put that color on whatever he was writing about this. And what I've said in my books is actually the perception was worse than the reality. The vast majority of schools did not get rid of various forms of Bible reading. Some were more devotional, some were less devotional. As someone who grew up in Texas in public schools in the 1970s, we still had prayer and Bible reading with the public address system more than 10 years after the U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And so without a doubt, there was a lot of that going on. But there actually was a backlash to this perception. There really was a significant perception that was existing, and you look at journals, religious journals during this period of time, and they're all just railing about this. Maybe they're railing too much. And so in the early 20th century, you actually had 16 states, I think is what the number is, who all passed laws actually mandating or allowing some type of religious exercises in public schools in reaction to what had gone on in the 19th century. And so actually when we entered the 20th century in the 1920s and 1930s, that loses some disfavor after the fundamentalism controversies in the 1920s. But still, when we enter that period, you actually see an increase in Bible reading in some of the schools. But still, there was a study that was conducted, the National Education Association, but then there was a private researcher, Richard Darrenfield, I think it was, and actually his son, Bruce, wrote a book about the school prayer decisions recently. But Darrenfield was a reporter in the 1950s and also a statistician. And he did a study, and according to his study, which I think is a little more scientific, he documented that only approximately 40% of the school districts in the country, prior to the U.S. Supreme Court decisions, were engaging in any type of organized prayer and Bible reading in the public schools. So parts of the country, it happened all over the place, but other parts of the country, it was not happening at all. Sorry, that was too long an answer.
Okay then. Thank you very much.